first chapter of In the Wake of War, The Ballard Chronicles, Book 1, by Stephen L Nowland. Chapter 1, Aislinn. In the northeastern corner of the great island of Feydwyr, nestled between two mountain ranges and the sparkling waters of the northern straits, was the kingdom of Aislinn, one of the most populous and wealthy realms in the land. These riches were not counted in gold or gems, but in the vast tracts of verdant plains which produced a bounty of food, far more than the kingdom needed for itself, with the excess sold to neighboring lands for a very tidy profit. At the center of the kingdom, surrounded by farms, was a small town called Braxford. It was the hub for those who worked the land, as well as merchants and people who simply enjoyed the country life. The largest building in town was the Braxfordshire Arms Inn, a huge two-story place which served as a temporary stopover for travelers. It was old, but renowned for its warm hospitality and a good night's rest. This night, however, one of its residents wasn't sleeping very well at all. Lying among her twisted blankets, Aislinn Ballard dreamed of a less peaceful time when the town that had been home for her 12 years of life was invaded by soldiers, searching for someone of importance staying at the inn, a young lady of royal blood. They wore red tabards, stank of sweat, and carried swords and axes openly. In the common room, her friends and their parents, whom Aislinn had known all of her short life, were bullied and shouted at. Her father, a big man who wasn't afraid of anyone, pulled out a trusty hardwood club from behind the bar and stepped into harm's way. He had already witnessed what happened to those who stood up to these soldiers, yet courageously took them on anyway. He was no match for professional soldiers armed with steel, receiving a gauntlet to his face for daring to oppose them. Aislinn, only 8 years old at the time, cowered under a table and watched the horrible events unfold, powerless to help, as a captain of the royal guard, an escort of their esteemed visitor, was quickly subdued with a series of blows to his helmeted head. Blood trickled down the side of his face and dripped on the wooden floor as he joined her father, who clutched at his own bruised face to stop the bleeding. One of the soldiers returned from upstairs, dragging a lovely blonde woman behind him. She kicked and screamed as they took her through the side door and vanished, leaving the distraught people of the common room shaking in fear. In her dream, when Aislinn emerged from under the table, the scene had changed to 3 months later, when the war had come to Braxford's doorstep. She didn't even know what the fighting was all about, but once more the town had come under attack, this time from soldiers in dirty tabards of white and gold, men who were unshaven, rough, and spoke a strange language. With the town's defenders easily overwhelmed, the newcomers terrorized the townsfolk for days. Her dad did his best to keep the peace, even if he took a few more lumps on his head in the process. Aislinn did what she was told, kept her head down, and served the invaders as if they were regular customers, trying to ignore the fear in the townsfolk's faces. Now and then, when she found some time to herself, she would go to the stables where nobody would see her crying. Then, sounds of fighting erupted in the town, and Aislinn thought more soldiers were coming to finish them off. When she looked out of a window and saw a small, silvery dragon land in the street, a feeling of awe swept over her. The dragon strode into the ranks of their oppressors in a fury of claws and lightning, a riveting display of power. When the battle was over, Aislinn crept outside, slowly moving towards the proud creature as it sat in the middle of the street. She reached out for it with one hand, almost touching the magnificent creature as she drew ever closer. Even though she had seen what it could do, Aislinn approached with confidence and felt no fear. As she touched its side, she was surprised to find its flank felt furry, not scaly, and her confusion increased when the dragon turned and began to lick her face. She awakened to find her hands deep in the fur of a large cat lying on top of her, cleaning her cheek with its rough tongue. "Cut it out, Keg," Aislinn complained in a sleepy voice, shoving the huge ginger tomcat to one side. Keg, purring loudly enough to wake half the inn, sat on the bed, swishing his tail, satisfied his job was done. The room was almost completely dark, but for a sliver of dim gray light coming through the window shutters. It was nearly dawn, and her cat was letting her know in no uncertain terms that it was time for food. Aislinn took a moment to rub her eyes and shrug off the horrible dream. The memory of those events was burned into her mind. Even 4 years later, the feeling of being powerless lingered. For months after the second attack on the town, she had hardly left her father's side, made worse when the town was evacuated 2 years later when the kingdom was invaded yet again. It was only in the last year that she had found the courage to sleep in her own room. Her hand strayed across the bedside table to where a large sheathed dagger lay, a gift from a friend during the war. Simply touching the leather-wrapped hilt of the weapon was enough to help her shrug off the dream and focus on the present. Keg gave a throaty meow as a reminder of his empty belly, and Aislinn responded by playfully tossing the bed covers over him before clambering out of bed to start the day. The room was freezing as she hurried across the bare floor to put on her slippers. After quickly taking care of her morning routine, she put on a plain brown dress and picked up the dagger, taking special care as she strapped it to her back. Once secured, she drew the weapon and brandished it before her, marveling at the shine of its metal and its balance in her hand, before sheathing it once more. She put on a worn, oversized jacket, which covered the weapon and provided some extra warmth. Her father did not approve of her carrying the knife around all the time, and she had made a promise not to, meaning Aislinn had to be extra careful not to be discovered, or she'd be in trouble. Finally ready, she left the bedroom with Keg hurrying past to make sure she didn't get lost on the way to his food bowl. Aislinn had a few stops to make beforehand, however. Across the hallway in the near darkness were 2 other doors, and she quietly knocked on the nearest before turning the handle. "Wake up, Dad," she ordered the room's sole occupant. The sound of someone rolling over to try to get more sleep could be heard, muttering something about, "I'll be up in a minute." "Your minutes can go on for hours, Dad," Aislinn pointed out before the sound of snoring rumbled around the room. Rolling her eyes at Keg, she closed the door and headed down the hallway, doing her best to ignore the other room on her left as she passed. It was too early in the day to deal with that. Even in the dark, Aislinn knew her way around the cold inn better than just about anyone except her father. She found a lantern perched on the usual shelf, and once it was lit, headed through a small doorway and down a flight of stairs into the even colder larder. Keg, anticipating what was to come, sat at the top of the stairs, while Aislinn took a small slice of prepared meat from the shelf and tossed it to the hungry cat. "You should find more mice instead of eating our food," she admonished the hefty feline as he tore into the meat while making little growling noises. She then went about the morning ritual, lighting the fireplace, the stove in the kitchen, and 3 other lanterns, while stifling the urge to yawn. Shortly afterward, she unlocked the front door and breathed in the rich air of late spring. Keg took the opportunity presented and dashed outside, hoping to fulfill his duty hunting mice, but more likely to find a comfortable spot to laze about in the warmth of the rising sun. Above the door hung a battered sign saying, "Braxfordshire R Inn," in florid script, missing a chunk of wood with some important letters on it, yet still conveying the inn's general purpose to passers-by. Like everything else in their lives, it would just have to last a little bit longer. Returning to the kitchen, She struggled to lift a heavy pot containing a hearty soup from last night's meal onto the stove to become this morning's breakfast. As she stoked the fire some more, Vicky arrived. A chubby young woman with curly brown hair, Vicky was responsible for running the kitchens, and although friendly, she had an annoying habit of assuming Aislinn didn't know how to do anything. Naturally, Vicky took the time to explain every little task and pat her on the head afterwards, as if Aislinn were an obedient dog. When she brought this up with her dad, he had simply replied, "Keep your ears open, you might learn something." This morning, Aislinn was learning the task of chopping tired vegetables with a blunt knife, because Vicky didn't think she could be trusted with anything sharper. When her back was turned, Aislinn would glare at her and make faces, making sure her face was perfectly normal whenever Vicky turned back again. It was a small consolation, considering the small mountain of vegetables Aislinn had to chop in preparation for the day's cooking. With the sun well and truly above the horizon, people began arriving from their rooms upstairs and through the front door, seeking a filling meal to start their day. Ordinarily, Aislinn's father would be at the counter by now, taking orders and making the guests comfortable. His position was still vacant, however, and Aislinn occasionally glanced at the doorway, wondering what was taking him so long. "It seems your father was up late with his friends again," Vicky muttered, also noticing the absence. "I'll go and see what's keeping him," Aislinn offered, looking for any opportunity to get away from her chopping duties. "No, keep at it, or we'll have nothing to serve come the noon meal," Vicky sighed. "I'll work the counter till he gets here. And hopefully Kirsten will be here soon as well." Taking off her apron, Vicky went to the counter to serve the customers, leaving Aislinn to continue preparing the veggies for a little longer before deciding on a faster way. Glancing around to make sure she was alone, she set aside the dull old knife and reached under her jacket. With a faint rasp of metal, she drew her magnificent dagger and began using it on the vegetables. Aislinn was always careful with it, for knives in general were dangerous, and this one was the sharpest one she had ever seen. It sliced through potatoes, carrots, and pumpkin with incredible ease, and before long, Aislinn was chopping up a storm. By the time Vicky returned a few minutes earlier, the mountain of vegetables had been prepared, and Aislinn stood there, dagger hidden once more, and looking as casual about her accomplishment as possible. "My word! It looks like you've gotten the hang of it," Vicky marveled. "Have some breakfast, and then we'll start service." Aislinn smiled innocently and picked up a bowl, then ladled some of the bubbling soup into it. She tore off a hunk of stale bread from a nearby loaf, sat down, and ate her fill. Her dad finally arrived and took over at the counter, giving Aislinn a wink as he went past. He was a big man with a rotund belly, short dark hair, which was going gray around the edges, and friendly brown eyes. He walked with a limp and groaned a little every now and then as he hobbled along, a legacy from his encounter with those soldiers years ago. Though he tried to hide it, the leg was a constant source of pain, and he wasn't as strong as he used to be. With the morning service fully underway, Vicky instructed Aislinn to work the tables, but stopped her just before she headed out into the common room. "Oh, let's take a moment to tidy you up a bit, Aislinn," the cook suggested. "You're a bit of a mess." Vicky took a stiff brush and used it to smooth the tangles out of Aislinn's hair, causing her to wince every time the brush became caught in her long auburn locks. "You could be a pretty little girl if you'd take your time," Vicky admonished her as she continued to work. "A pity your mother isn't around to show you all this, God bless her. You have her dark eyes, though." Aislinn tried to reply, but winced in pain as the rough brushing continued. Vicky's love was a bit harsh sometimes. Once she was considered tidy enough, Aislinn was given a plate of food and instructions as to where it should go. She hurried out into the common room and was surprised at how many customers were there. "Oh, haven't seen it this busy in years," her father remarked from the bar, gazing at the busy room with a wide smile. "There's a lot of travelers coming in from the north," Kirsten explained as she dashed past, She was a cheerful girl, twice Aislin's age, with red hair and a wide smile that showed off her dimpled cheeks. Mostly merchants, but I think there's a few coming in for the archery tournament. You're really going to have to hire some more help. Oh, I think you and Aislinn can handle it for now, Aislin's dad said with a dismissive wave. Merchants don't stay long, and if the tournament turnout is as bad as last year, we'd be operating at a loss. Frankly, we could use the extra coin. Go to it, Chook, he said to Aislinn, who gave him a confident smile and headed into the bustling room. The next couple of hours were a blur as the understaffed inn struggled to keep up with the sudden demand. A few months short of 13, Aislinn was perhaps too small to be working this sort of job, or any sort when she thought about it. She would have much preferred to be playing with the other children in town or going to school. But with times as rough as they were, and her father's injury, Aislinn felt she was needed at the inn more than her classes, so she dropped out of school to help keep the place running. Her size worked against her when carrying some of the larger meals, and people had a habit of not noticing her until the last moment. When she had started working the tables last year, she had been knocked about on more than occasion. But since then, Aislinn had learned to anticipate when someone was about to stumble into her. She could squeeze her tiny frame through the narrowest of gaps and practically dance through the throng without dropping a plate or being run over, much to the amusement of the patrons. As usual, the crowd consisted mostly of women. The few men present were typically quite old, with younger men very scarce indeed over the last couple of years. Aislinn tried not to think about it too much, choosing instead to focus on her work. The crowd shrank once breakfast was over and things became a little easier. Vicky tasked Aislinn with the dishes in preparation for the lunch service. It wasn't difficult, however, and gave her time to study a book Kirsten had opened before her. With their livelihood at stake, Aislinn may not have been able to attend school, but that was no excuse to avoid learning. Give it another try, the energetic waitress prompted as she went back and forth over the floor with him up. I know what I did wrong, Aislinn protested. It sounded funny when I read it aloud, but it says read on the page. The jolly merchant read the red book. She repeated, How come read and read are spelled the same if they're said differently? I have no idea, honey. Kirsten laughed while Aislinn began to rethink this whole reading thing. They continued debating this until the dishes were done, and Aislinn had time for an early lunch before the inn became busy again. She poured a bowl of thick stew Vicky had been cooking all morning and tossed some stale bread on top of the stove, then walked through the common room and up a set of narrow stairs. This area was normally reserved for paying customers to rest overnight, but Aislinn knew of a little secret. In a nearly forgotten closet, there was a ladder leading up through a hatch in the ceiling into the attic. From there, a small door led out of a raised section of the inn's roof, where Aislinn emerged into the radiant sunshine. Moving carefully across the thatch, she sat and ate her lunch, enjoying the warmth of the approaching summer and the scene of her lovely little hometown spread before her. She loved this town, and only from here could she see the whole place at once. It briefly occurred to her that sitting on the roof was another of those things her father wouldn't approve of if he learned about it. The less he knew about her daily routine, the better.